She thought she was in control. She thought the rules were hers to enforce. The power hers to wield. But in a single moment, a single mistake, she lost everything. On a routine flight, Rebecca Langley, a veteran flight attendant, made a decision that would unravel her entire career. It was supposed to be simple: enforce first-class seating, maintain order. But when she laid hands on the wrong passenger, when she questioned the wrong woman, she set off a chain of events that she never saw coming. Because Clara Johnson was no ordinary passenger. What started as a quiet challenge turned into a national scandal. A single text message set the wheels of justice in motion. And as the plane touched down, Rebecca wasn't just facing an upset traveler, she was facing the man who owned the airline. What followed was a reckoning. A brutal fall from grace. And the kind of lesson that came too late. What happens when the enforcer becomes the condemned? When the gatekeeper is locked out? When power turns on those who abuse it? Stay till the end to witness the shocking conclusion. But first, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you love stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now, let's begin. The airport was alive with the restless energy of people moving from one destination to another. The overhead announcements droned in the background. Suitcases rolled across the polished floors. And travelers murmured in anticipation of their flights. It was a familiar chaos, predictable in its unpredictability. At Gate 17, Clara Johnson stood with quiet grace. A woman who had long since learned that the world rarely made space for her willingly. She was 72, with silver-threaded curls tucked neatly beneath a navy blue headscarf. She wore an elegant but simple dress. A shawl draped across her shoulders like a shield against the cold indifference of the world. She had purchased a first-class ticket. A small indulgence she allowed herself after decades of hard work, years spent as a teacher. Shaping young minds, guiding them towards something better than what she had endured. If anyone had earned the right to this seat, it was her. The gate agent, a young man with a professional but distant smile, scanned her ticket. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Johnson. Have a wonderful flight." She nodded politely, adjusting the strap of her purse as she made her way down the jet bridge. Inside the first-class cabin, the air smelled of leather, perfume, and privilege. The seats were wide, the lighting dimmed to a soft glow, and the passengers, mostly businessmen in expensive suits, were already making themselves comfortable. Clara moved with quiet dignity to seat 1B, placing her bag neatly beneath the chair before smoothing the wrinkles from her dress. She had just reached for her book when she heard it. A voice, sharp and clipped, cut through the hushed atmosphere. "Excuse me, ma'am." Clara turned, finding herself face to face with Rebecca Langley, a flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform. The woman had the posture of someone accustomed to authority, the kind of person who believed compliance was the natural order of things. "This is first class." The words weren't a question. They were a challenge. Clara held her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm aware." Rebecca's eyes flickered to the boarding pass in Clara's hand. "May I see your ticket?" Clara had seen this before: the hesitation, the doubt, the search for an excuse. It was a dance she had performed too many times in her life. She handed over her ticket without a word. Rebecca scanned it, her brows knitting together. The seat number was correct. The name matched the manifest. And yet, she hesitated, as if reality itself had betrayed her expectations. Still, she forced a tight-lipped smile and handed it back. "Just making sure." Clara took her ticket, nodded, and turned back to her book. But she knew better than to believe the matter was settled. Minutes passed. The last passengers boarded. The overhead bins clicked shut. But Clara had barely read 2 pages before Rebecca was back, standing just a little too close. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move." Clara didn't look up immediately. She marked her page with her finger, took a slow breath, and then met the woman's gaze. "Move?" Rebecca crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one foot. "There's been a mistake. This seat isn't available for you." A pause, a hesitation. The words she wanted to say dangled in the space between them. Clara set her book down deliberately. "My ticket says 1B. "I know," Rebecca said, her voice clipped, "but this seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." There it was. A few heads turned, but most of the passengers pretended not to hear. That was always the way of things. People could watch injustice unfold right before their eyes and convince themselves it was none of their concern. Clara sat a little straighter. And what kind of passenger am I? Rebecca hesitated. Just for a second. She had expected compliance. She had expected Clara to yield. To gather her things. To know her place. Instead, Clara was waiting for an explanation. For a reason that would hold weight in the daylight. Rebecca's lips pressed together. I just meant. Clara raised a hand, stopping her. If there's a real issue with my seat, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'd like to hear it from the captain. The words landed like a slap. Rebecca's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being questioned. That won't be necessary. Then I won't be moving. Silence. Rebecca's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Her face was tight, her body rigid with frustration. Clara could see it, the battle happening behind her eyes. And then, in a move no one expected, Rebecca grabbed Clara's arm. Listen, lady. She never finished the sentence. Because Clara pulled back sharply. And at that exact moment, a hand small and wrinkled, but strong, came across the space between them. The sound of the slap rang through the cabin. A stunned hush fell over the room. The businessmen in their suits. The passengers pretending not to listen. Even the other flight attendants, everyone froze. Rebecca's mouth fell open slightly. Her own hand raised in the air as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Clara, however, sat perfectly still. Her face had turned slightly from the force of the slap. But when she looked back at Rebecca, she was not angry. She was disappointed. Across the aisle, a man cleared his throat as if preparing to say something. But the weight of the silence crushed him back into his seat. The younger flight attendant, Lisa, took a small step forward. Did you just? She whispered. Her face pale. Rebecca blinked, her breath coming fast. She hadn't meant to do that. Or at least, she hadn't meant for so many people to see. Clara didn't rub her cheek. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her purse, took out her phone, and typed a short message. Then, with quiet dignity, she set it down on the armrest and folded her hands in her lap. Rebecca swallowed hard. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. And she had no idea who she had just put her hands on. The slap still echoed in the silence. A sound that seemed to suspend time itself. It lingered not just in the air but in the bones of every person present. Vibrating beneath their carefully constructed facades of indifference. Rebecca Langley, the flight attendant who had just crossed an irreversible line, stood frozen, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her hand, the same one that had dared to touch Clara Johnson, now hovered mid-air as if it, too, realized the gravity of what it had done. Clara remained seated, composed in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if she had spent a lifetime preparing for this very moment. She had not raised her voice. She had not retaliated. She had simply picked up her phone and sent a message. And that message was already changing the course of the evening. Across the aisle, a businessman in a pressed gray suit shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched toward the in-flight Wi-Fi panel on his screen, as if itching to check the news before it even broke. A young couple further down the row exchanged quick, meaningful glances, while an older woman, perhaps in her 60s, with pearl earrings and the kind of silent guilt that comes from knowing better but doing nothing, folded her hands tightly in her lap. No one spoke. No one ever spoke in moments like these. Rebecca blinked hard, the weight of the stares pressing into her like a vice. She knew she had to act. Had to fix this. Had to regain control before the narrative spun beyond her grasp. She straightened her posture, squared her shoulders, and forced her voice into something resembling authority. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move. Again, the demand. Again, the attempt to reclaim a power that was already slipping from her fingers. Clara did not move. She did not even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying Rebecca in a way that made the younger woman feel stripped bare. Like all the layers of her carefully constructed self were being peeled back to reveal something raw and unguarded beneath. And if I don't? Rebecca hesitated. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Passengers like Clara, people like Clara, weren't supposed to ask questions. They were supposed to nod politely, collect their things, and move along like shadows slipping through spaces they had never been truly welcome in. But Clara was still sitting there. And now, everyone was watching. Rebecca's hands curled into fists at her sides. Her face burned not just with anger, but with something dangerously close to fear. She knew this was getting out of control. She could feel it spiraling. She took a deep breath. If you refuse, she said, her voice quieter now, measured. I will have to call security. Another pause. Clara let the words settle. Let them breathe. Let them carry the weight of their true meaning. I will have to call security. Not, I will have to resolve this misunderstanding. Not, I will have to check with the captain. Not, I will have to review the seating chart. No, it was security. Because that was how these things were always handled. Weren't they? The implied threat. The suggestion that compliance wasn't really a choice at all. The quiet understanding that any resistance, no matter how justified, could be escalated into something far worse. And then just as Rebecca reached for the in-flight phone, just as she prepared to dial the number that would summon the authorities to handle the problem she herself had created, a voice rang out. Is there a problem here? It was Lisa Carter, the younger flight attendant who had been standing nearby, her expression a mixture of hesitation and quiet alarm. Rebecca turned sharply. No problem, she said, a little too quickly. I was just. Lisa's eyes flickered from Rebecca to Clara, then back again. It doesn't look like no problem. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Lisa, bless her naive little heart, didn't understand how delicate this situation had become. She didn't understand the stakes. Go back to the galley. Lisa, Rebecca hissed under her breath. Lisa didn't move. Instead, she looked at Clara, and for the first time since this ordeal began, someone's eyes held something other than indifference. Mrs. Johnson, Lisa said softly, are you all right? Clara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried an entire lifetime's worth of battles fought and endured. I'm just fine, dear. Rebecca exhaled sharply, frustration blooming into something dangerously close to panic. She needed to end this. Now. And so she made a choice. A desperate, reckless choice. She turned, grabbed the in-flight phone, and pressed the button that connected her directly to the cockpit. The intercom crackled to life. Captain, we have a situation in first class. A passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions. I need ground security upon landing. A long pause. Then, the captain's voice came through. Calm and measured. Name of the passenger? Rebecca licked her lips. Clara Johnson. Another pause. Longer. This time. Then, a different voice came through. A voice that did not belong to the captain. A voice that was deeper. Steadier. Sharper. This is Robert Johnson. Would you like to repeat what you just said? Rebecca's blood ran cold. She felt her fingers tremble against the phone. The name. The name. It hit her like a freight train. She had known that name. She had read about him, Robert Johnson. One of the most powerful men in the aviation industry. A businessman, a philanthropist, a man who had spent decades shaping the very airline she worked for. And she had just tried to have his wife escorted off his own damn plane. Silence swallowed the first-class cabin whole. Passengers, who had been cautiously pretending not to listen, now turned fully in their seats. Eyes widened, whispers started. Lisa took a sharp step back, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to dread. And Rebecca, who had spent her career believing herself to be untouchable, who had believed she had the authority to dictate who belonged where, felt the walls close in around her. The intercom crackled again. Miss Langley. Robert Johnson's voice was slow, controlled, dangerous. I asked you a question. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she had already lost, and there was no coming back from this. Rebecca Langley felt her stomach drop as the intercom fell silent, the weight of Robert Johnson's voice hanging in the air like an unspoken judgment. The cabin had shifted, no longer a luxurious sanctuary of whispered conversations and overpriced champagne, but a courtroom where she stood, exposed, guilty, and awaiting sentence. Passengers who had previously buried themselves in newspapers and tablets were now openly watching. The quiet hum of first-class travel had been replaced by something sharper. Something electric. Rebecca gripped the in-flight phone tighter, her knuckles white. Mr. Johnson, she started, her voice carefully measured. There's been a misunderstanding. The silence that followed was the kind that swallowed excuses whole. And then, Robert Johnson spoke again. Oh, a misunderstanding. The words were calm, almost thoughtful. Rebecca swallowed hard. Yes, sir. There was an issue with the seating, and I was simply trying to resolve it. Another pause. Then, and in resolving it, Miss Langley, you put your hands on my wife? Rebecca's heart pounded. She knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer, but saying it aloud would seal her fate. Clara Johnson, still seated, still composed, reached for her tea and took a slow sip. She had seen this play out too many times in her life. Different settings, different faces, but always the same story. A white woman, caught in the act, suddenly scrambling for an escape. Rebecca's breath was uneven. Yet it wasn't like that. She insisted, her voice thin, desperate. I was trying to enforce policy. No, Miss Langley. Robert's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. What you were doing was enforcing your own expectations of who belongs where. A hush fell over the cabin. The kind of silence that comes when a truth too heavy to ignore is spoken aloud. Rebecca's pulse raced. She could feel it now, the moment slipping away from her. Control pried from her grasp finger by finger. She turned to the captain for help, for some kind of lifeline. But Captain Harris was standing at the entrance to the first-class cabin now. Arms folded, expression unreadable. He had been listening, and from the look in his eyes, he was not on her side. Rebecca tried again. Sir, please, tell me, Miss Langley. Robert interrupted. Had my wife been a different woman, a different color, would you have asked for her ticket not once, but twice? Would you have put your hands on her? Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no right answer to that question. Clara Johnson watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had been through this before. It was always the same. First came the accusation, then the denial, then the scrambling for justification. The steps were so familiar she could have choreographed them herself. She let her eyes drift toward the window. Not because she wasn't paying attention, but because she knew this was the part where she simply had to wait. The rest would take care of itself. Rebecca was still standing there, breathing too fast, looking too small for someone who had walked onto this plane believing she held all the power. Mr. Johnson, she pleaded, I didn't mean any harm. Robert's voice was smooth, deadly. That's the problem, Miss Langley. And then, the cockpit door opened. The lead flight supervisor, Martha Caldwell, stepped into the cabin, a tablet in one hand, a grim look on her face. She had received the call, reviewed the security footage, and now stood before Rebecca with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Miss Langley, she said, voice clipped, professional, you are to step away from the passenger immediately. Rebecca's breath caught. Wait, Martha didn't blink. You have been relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers straightened in their seats. Others exchanged glances. A few, especially the older ones, knew exactly what was happening here. Rebecca's lips trembled. You can't be serious. Martha's expression did not change. I need you to retrieve your belongings and take the crew jump seat in the back of the plane. You will not engage with passengers again for the remainder of this flight. Rebecca's whole body felt cold. No, this wasn't happening. This was not how this was supposed to go. She had spent years climbing the ranks, following the rules, earning her place. She was respected, feared even. She was supposed to be untouchable. And yet, here she was, standing in front of the wrong person, at the wrong time, with no power left to wield. She looked around desperately, waiting for anyone to come to her defense. But no one spoke for her. Because when the powerful fall, people rarely reach out to catch them. Clara, finally, turned her head and met Rebecca's eyes. And then she did something that sent a chill down the younger woman's spine. She smiled. Not a cruel smile, not smug, just a quiet, knowing smile. A smile that said, I've seen this before. And I will see it again. Rebecca's fingers curled into fists. She wanted to fight back, to scream that this was unfair, that this was wrong. But she knew deep down, where the truth had been buried beneath years of privilege and assumption, that this was not wrong. This was justice. And it had come for her in a way she had never seen coming. She took a slow, shaky breath, forced her head high, and turned toward the back of the plane. Passengers whispered as she walked past. Some took out their phones. Others shook their heads. Rebecca could feel the heat of humiliation burning up her spine. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was knowing that when she stepped off this plane, she wouldn't be stepping back into the life she had known. Because Robert Johnson wasn't just any man. And Clara Johnson wasn't just any woman. And this wasn't just any mistake. This was the end. And there was no undoing it. The sound of footsteps down the narrow aisle was the only thing that could be heard. The cabin, once a quiet haven for the privileged, had transformed into something else entirely. No longer just a place of convenience and comfort. It had become a stage, a place where the hidden tensions of the world had risen to the surface. Raw and undeniable, Rebecca Langley walked stiffly, her body held taut with a desperation she hadn't yet fully acknowledged. Her hands clenched at her sides, her breath coming faster than it should. She was a professional. She had always been one of the best, one of the sharpest. She had known how to handle difficult passengers, how to diffuse situations before they got out of control. And yet, she had never seen this coming. Not the way the cabin had turned against her. Not the way her own colleagues had distanced themselves. Not the way her power, the authority she had always wielded so easily, had crumbled beneath her feet. Rebecca forced herself to keep walking. She could feel the eyes on her, pressing into her like weights she could not shake off. She had never been on this side of things before. At the back of the plane, the crew jump seat sat waiting for her, a place of humiliation. A silent acknowledgement that she was no longer in control. It was a small thing, but in an industry built on hierarchy, on the unspoken rules of who commanded respect and who followed orders. It was everything. Rebecca sat down, her fingers gripping the edges of the seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, lingered nearby, her face pale with something close to sympathy. But Rebecca didn't want sympathy. She wanted to turn back time. She wanted to undo the moment she had reached for Clara Johnson's arm. Wanted to snatch back the words she had spoken. Wanted to pretend that none of this had ever happened. But it had happened. And now, the world was watching. Above the clouds, below the surface, back in first class, Clara Johnson sat with quiet dignity, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched tee. She had been here before, not in this exact seat, not on this exact plane, but in this moment, the moment when the world realized. She could feel it, the shifting energy in the cabin. The passengers who had initially avoided her gaze were now looking at her with something else in their eyes. Awareness, guilt, because they had seen it. They had seen what they had always known but never spoken of, the subtle, suffocating truth that not everyone is treated the same way. A few of them had likely experienced it themselves, if only in smaller, quieter ways. A woman ignored at a business meeting. A man spoken over at a dinner party. A moment of dismissal so casual, so practiced, that it barely registered to those who had never lived it. And yet, here, in this cabin, it had been laid bare. Clara let out a slow breath. She did not rejoice in Rebecca Langley's fall. No, this wasn't about revenge. This was about something much larger. It was about accountability. About the way the world had taught people like Rebecca that their judgments were law. Their assumptions unchallenged. Their hands free to act without consequence. Until today. Clara glanced down at her phone. The screen still glowing faintly from the message she had sent. One message, one moment, and everything had changed. She had not needed to shout. She had not needed to demand. She had simply told the truth. And now, Robert Johnson was waiting for them on the ground. The descent. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of conversation was subdued. The clinking of glasses muted. Even the attendants moved differently. Lisa, still shaken, stood near the galley, her hands busying themselves with small, unnecessary tasks. She knew what was coming. They all did. Rebecca, from her seat at the back, stared straight ahead. She did not check her phone. She did not speak. She simply waited. For the first time in her life, she understood what it was to be powerless. She understood what it meant to sit in a space where decisions were being made about her, where choices were being formed that would shape her future. And she had no say in any of it. She had thought herself untouchable. But no one was untouchable. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and tray tables are in their upright position." The end was coming. And for Rebecca Langley, the runway had never felt closer. The arrival. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires kissing the tarmac with an almost mocking gentleness. Rebecca's fingers twitched against her lap. She knew what was waiting on the other side of that door. She had seen it in her mind's eye 100 times during the last hour, the moment she would step off this plane and come face to face with Robert Johnson. She could imagine the scene. The airport security officers standing at the gate. The executives from the airline. Their faces carefully neutral, but their presence alone saying everything that needed to be said. And at the center of it all, the man who held more power in this industry than she ever could. Robert Johnson. She had never met him in person before. But she was about to. The flight attendants prepared the cabin for disembarkation. But first-class passengers lingered longer than usual. They weren't in a rush to leave. They wanted to see how it ended. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, stretching, collecting their belongings, but their movements were slow, deliberate. And then, the cabin door opened, and there he was, Robert Johnson, tall, impeccably dressed, unshaken. His presence alone sent a ripple through the plane, a quiet, unseen force that shifted the very air. Rebecca's breath hitched. She could see him speaking with the captain, his voice low but commanding. Then, without even looking in her direction, he gestured toward security, and just like that they came for her. A uniformed officer stepped forward. "Miss Langley, please come with us." Rebecca's world narrowed into a single, suffocating moment. She could feel every eye on her, every whisper, every phone that had been lifted discreetly, capturing the last moments of a career that had just gone up in flames. She turned, her face pale, her steps slow, and for the first time in her life, she realized, this is what it feels like. To be removed, to be dismissed, to be told, without words, you do not belong here. The world moved around her, unbothered, as she was escorted down the jet bridge, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with every step. And back in her seat, Clara Johnson took one last sip of her tea, set the cup down gently, and watched as the plane emptied. Justice had been served, and she had never had to raise her voice. The air inside the airport was thick, not just with the usual hum of travelers moving toward their destinations, but with something heavier, something that clung to the space between people. It was the weight of knowledge, of realization, and Rebecca Langley could feel every ounce of it pressing into her as she stepped off the jet bridge, escorted by two uniformed security officers. Her breath was shallow, her pulse rapid. She had walked through these terminals 1,000 times before. Head held high, uniform crisp, exuding authority with every step. But this was different. Her badge was gone, her uniform no longer a symbol of her power, but of her failure. Her name, once a respected one among the flight crew, was now a cautionary tale. And ahead of her, standing just beyond the security checkpoint, Robert Johnson was waiting. He did not fidget, he did not pace, he simply stood there, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her with the kind of quiet, unwavering intensity that made the air around him feel colder. Rebecca had imagined this moment in many ways, but none of them felt as devastating as the reality of it. Her feet felt heavier with every step. Passengers who had been on the flight passed by, some stealing glances at her, some watching openly. A few whispered to one another, their voices hushed but unmistakable. "That's her. I heard she put her hands on that woman. She's done." Rebecca clenched her jaw. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the floor, to turn around and run. But there was no escape. Not from this. And then she was standing in front of him. Robert Johnson. Up close. He was even more formidable. The kind of man who didn't have to raise his voice to command attention. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. He studied her, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle into her bones. Then, at last, he spoke. "Do you know why you're here, Miss Langley?" Rebecca swallowed hard. "Sir, no excuses." The words were sharp, clean, a scalpel cutting through her feeble attempt at damage control. Rebecca's mouth snapped shut. She felt small, exposed. "I know exactly the kind of person you are," Robert continued, his voice eerily calm. "I have seen you before. You wear a uniform, you enforce the rules, but what you're really enforcing is your own idea of who is welcome and who is not." Rebecca's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say that it wasn't like that it had never been about race, that she had simply been doing her job. But she couldn't, because they both knew that would be a lie. Robert took a slow step closer. Just enough to make her feel the full weight of his presence. "You looked at my wife," he said, "and you assumed she didn't belong." Rebecca's throat tightened. And when she refused to bow to your authority," Robert continued, cutting her off, "you tried to force her." The words landed like a hammer. breaking something inside her that she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. Her chest tightened, shame curling hot and relentless in her stomach. Robert exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You could have stopped at questioning her. You could have stopped at making her prove her seat. But you didn't. The pause stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. This wasn't just about this flight. This was about every flight, every restaurant, every boardroom, every moment when someone like Clara had been questioned, scrutinized, and pushed aside because someone like Rebecca had decided they didn't belong. Rebecca's breath came faster. She wanted to scream that she was sorry, that it had been a mistake, that she had never meant for things to go this far. But she knew deep down, in the part of herself she had never truly examined before, that this wasn't just a mistake. This was who she was. And now, the world was seeing it. A sentence without mercy. Robert glanced at the airline executive standing beside him, a tall woman in a dark navy suit. She nodded once, stepping forward. Her voice was smooth, professional. Miss Langley, effective immediately. Your employment with this airline has been terminated. Rebecca's stomach dropped. She had known it was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way she hadn't been ready for. Your credentials have been revoked. The woman continued. A note has been placed on your employment record. Rebecca's breath turned shallow. A note. She knew what that meant. Her career was over. No airline would touch her after this. Not with a record that said she had put her hands on a passenger, the wife of the most powerful man in the industry. Her hands shook. Please return your uniform and employee ID before you leave the premises. The executive finished. Rebecca's lips parted, a plea forming on her tongue. But Robert spoke one final time. His voice was softer now, but no less firm. Enjoy your last day in the sky, Miss Langley. Rebecca flinched. She felt those words in the marrow of her bones. And then, without another glance, Robert turned and walked away. Just like that, as if she had already disappeared. The walk of the forgotten. Security didn't have to drag her. She walked on her own, stiff and hollow, each step heavier than the last. The people around her, the ones she had worked with, the ones she had commanded, the ones who had once respected her, would not meet her eyes. She had become something else now. Not a leader, not a figure of authority, not even a villain. Just a warning, a whisper between employees, a cautionary tale in training manuals, a name that would be erased from rosters and schedules and spoken about only in hushed tones. And as she stepped out into the airport, the cold air hitting her face, she realized something that sent a fresh wave of dread crashing through her. This wasn't just the end of her career. This was the beginning of something she could never undo. Because no matter where she went, no matter how much time passed, people would remember, and she, for the first time in her life, would know what it meant to be invisible. The airport doors slid open, and Rebecca Langley stepped into the bitter air of a world she no longer recognized. Her breath hitched as the cold slapped against her skin, but it wasn't the wind that made her shiver. It was the absence, the sudden, terrifying absence of everything she had been. She had walked into this airport a woman of authority, a gatekeeper of order, someone who set the rules. She was walking out as no one. Around her, the airport moved as it always had. People rushed to catch flights. Families embraced in tearful goodbyes. Taxi drivers shouted over the din of rolling suitcases. No one looked at her. No one saw her. She had never been invisible before. But now, standing on the curb, stripped of her uniform, stripped of the confidence that had once fit her like a second skin, she understood something she had never been forced to understand before. To be invisible is to be powerless. To be invisible is to be unimportant. To be invisible is to exist in a world that does not bend to accommodate you, but instead shrugs you off, forgets you the moment you leave the room. She realized this was what Clara Johnson had felt. Not just on this flight, but in countless moments before it. And now, so did she. The fall that never ends. Rebecca dug into her bag, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy. She had been calling people for hours, former colleagues, old friends, anyone who might help her undo this. Voicemail, unanswered calls, short, clipped texts that all said the same thing without saying it outright. I can't be involved in this. I'm sorry, but it's out of my hands. I wish I could help. They weren't just avoiding her. They were distancing themselves the same way she had seen people do to others when trouble came knocking. She had never understood it before. Not really. She had always been on the right side of power. The right side of authority. Now, she was radioactive. A hazard. A liability. She scrolled through her contacts again. Desperate. Breath coming fast and uneven. There had to be someone. Someone who didn't know yet. Someone who owed her. Someone who would still see her as she had been. Not as she was now. She pressed a number. A former supervisor from another airline. A man she had once worked under before she transferred to her current job. The phone rang. And then a voice. Hesitant. Rebecca? She exhaled sharply, forcing a small, relieved laugh. Hey, thank God you answered. Listen, The voice interrupted her. Quiet. Careful. I heard what happened. Rebecca's mouth went dry. Listen, I can explain. It wasn't what they're saying. Another pause. It doesn't matter. Rebecca. Her stomach clenched. What do you mean it doesn't matter? You know me. You know I can't help you. The words landed like a blow to the chest. Rebecca stumbled back a step. As if the weight of them had pushed her off balance. Please. It was the first time she had ever said that word like this. Not as a demand. Not as a warning. As a plea. But there was no sympathy in the silence that followed. Just a sigh. And then, click. The line went dead. A world without mercy. Rebecca stared at the screen. The call had ended. But the freefall continued. She looked up, her vision blurring as she scanned the street. She had no plan, no next step. She had spent her entire career believing that the world had a place for her. That she belonged among the powerful, the respected, the ones who dictated the rules. She had never imagined a world in which she wasn't protected by those rules. And yet here she was. Alone. The other side of the glass. Across the street, through the wide airport windows. Clara Johnson stood near baggage claim, waiting for her luggage to arrive. She had not rushed. She had not panicked. She had simply waited. And now, as the carousel hummed to life and the first set of bags tumbled onto the belt, she reached out and retrieved her modest, well-worn suitcase. There had been no spectacle when she left the plane. No security officers trailing behind her. No hushed whispers condemning her name. Because the truth was, Clara had already won long before the flight had landed. She had won in the quiet refusal to be diminished. She had won in the way the world had watched and learned. And now she would go home. As she turned toward the exit, her eyes flicked to the glass doors and, just for a moment, locked onto Rebecca Langley, standing there, lost. A woman who had once believed she was untouchable. Now, a woman with nowhere to go. For a brief second, their eyes met. Rebecca breathless, desperate, stripped bare of everything she had once been. Clara calm, steady, whole. And then, just like that, Clara turned and walked away. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply left Rebecca there standing in the cold. In the silence. In the realization that this was not just a bad day. This was the rest of her life. The cold sat heavy on Rebecca Langley's skin. She had never really noticed the way the night air curled against the airport's glass doors. The way the outside world felt different when you were no longer stepping into it with purpose. With certainty. But there was no certainty now. Just the raw, trembling fact of her own undoing. She stood there, unmoving, watching through the windows as Clara Johnson disappeared into the steady rhythm of life unbothered. Unshaken, untouched by the ruin Rebecca had brought upon herself. Clara had never needed to fight back. She had never needed to raise her voice. She had simply been, and that had been enough to unravel everything Rebecca had built. Because power, as Rebecca had now learned, is not in uniforms. It is not in titles. It is in the way people remember you when you have no more power left to wield. And people would remember her. Not as a leader. Not as a woman who commanded respect. Not as the force she had once believed herself to be. They would remember her as the woman who had lost everything in the space of a single flight. The woman who had reached too quickly. Assumed too easily. Dismissed too freely until she found herself on the other side of the door. Looking in, she exhaled, ragged and uneven, and stepped back from the curb, forcing her feet to move. She had nowhere to go. The echo of choices. The subway was quieter than usual. It was late, the city settling into its own kind of exhaustion. Rebecca sat hunched in the corner of the train car, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse as if it might keep her tethered to something solid. She was still wearing the blouse and skirt from her uniform, But without the jacket, without the badge, she felt exposed like a fraud playing dress-up in a life that no longer belonged to her. A few seats down, a young black woman sat with her legs crossed, scrolling idly through her phone. At one point, she glanced up just for a second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. Rebecca braced herself for recognition, for a whisper, a pointed finger. But there was nothing. The woman simply looked past her. And somehow, that was worse. Rebecca had spent her whole life being seen. She had existed in spaces where her presence was an unspoken rule, where her authority was granted before she ever had to ask for it. Now, she was no one, and no one saw her. She turned her gaze to the window. But all she saw was her own reflection staring back. She barely recognized it. The past revisited. She had spent so many years believing that she had done everything right. She had followed the rules. She had worked hard. She had earned her place. But whose rules? Whose expectations had she truly upheld all this time? Rebecca squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice rising in the back of her mind, the one that whispered a truth she had never let herself acknowledge. She had been so sure that she had been the one who belonged, that it had been Clara who had needed to prove something. But the truth was simpler, uglier. Clara had not been the one on trial that day. Rebecca had. And she had failed. A memory that burns. She remembered being a little girl, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in a small Midwestern town, listening to the adults talk in hushed tones about the changing world. She had heard the warnings, the veiled concern about who was moving into certain neighborhoods, about how things weren't like they used to be. She had absorbed it without realizing. She had learned, young, that some people belonged effortlessly, and others had to prove themselves over and over again. She had carried that knowledge into adulthood, into her career. She had never said the words out loud, but she had lived by them. She had enforced them, until the world had turned, suddenly, and left her standing on the outside. No longer the one who judged, but the one being judged. The final stop. The train shuddered to a halt. Rebecca stood, her movements slow, stiff, like someone waking from a dream they couldn't quite understand. She stepped onto the platform. The city stretching out around her loud, indifferent, unchanged. The world had not stopped for her downfall. It never did. She started walking, not toward home because what was home now, but toward something, though she didn't know what. The night was deep and full of things she had never noticed before. The weight of her own choices. The echo of her own mistakes. The quiet truth that she had been blind to for so long. She thought, for a moment, of Clara Johnson. She thought of the way the older woman had simply waited. Waited, not for justice, but for the world to reveal itself. Because it always did. And now, it had revealed Rebecca Langley for what she truly was. A woman who had spent her whole life certain of her place. Only to realize, too late, that she had never truly earned it. The last lesson. At a bus stop bench, Rebecca sat down, her hands clasped between her knees. She had always believed that the fall from grace was loud, that it came with fire, with anger, with resistance. But it wasn't like that at all. The fall was quiet. It was a whisper, a realization. It was the moment when you finally understood that the world does not need you to continue turning. Rebecca had always thought she knew the difference between power and weakness. She had thought power was in control, in rules, in the ability to decide who belonged and who did not. She had been wrong. Power was in patience. It was in the way Clara had simply let the world move. It was in the way she had let Rebecca destroy herself. Rebecca sat there, as the night stretched on, and for the first time in her life, she asked herself a question she did not know the answer to. Who am I without the power I thought I had? And somewhere, in the distance, Clara Johnson went home, whole. The weight of everything had settled now. It did not crash, nor did it explode, it simply arrived. Like an unwelcome guest, planting itself in the spaces Rebecca Langley had once occupied with confidence. With certainty. She had walked through her life as though the ground beneath her feet had been paved just for her. Never questioning, never doubting. Now, she saw it for what it was. Not a road, but a privilege, one that had allowed her to move unchallenged, to dictate the rules of who was welcome, who was not, who had to prove themselves, and who was given the benefit of the doubt without question. That privilege had evaporated, and in its place, silence. Not the kind of silence that soothes. The kind that lingers in empty spaces. The kind that whispers you were wrong. A life rewritten. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Rebecca had always imagined that when disaster struck, it would come with fire and fury. She had never realized that ruin could be quiet. No calls. No offers. No invitations. The airline had not only fired her, they had erased her. There would be no next flight for her. No new airline to pick up the pieces of her career. Her name was flagged now. A mark on every hiring list in the industry. A quiet warning passed from one executive to another. Do not hire. The kind of stain that did not wash off. The kind that turned former colleagues into distant strangers. Their backs just a little too straight when they passed her in the grocery store. She was no longer one of them. And she never would be again. The mirror of the past. One afternoon, she found herself at a small diner. It wasn't a place she would have chosen before. Before, she had favored polished cafes. Restaurants where the waitstaff moved quickly to serve her. Where the air smelled of imported coffee beans and quiet certainty. But those places belonged to another version of herself. A version that no longer existed. So now, she sat in the corner of a small diner with flickering fluorescent lights and a sticky tabletop. Stirring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. She watched as the door swung open. A group of airline employees walking in, still in uniform. Still standing the way she used to stand. Still speaking in the same clipped, authoritative tone she had once used. They didn't notice her, and she felt the truth of it like a knife between her ribs. She was invisible now. It wasn't just about the job. It was about belonging. And she no longer belonged in the world she had once commanded. Her gaze drifted to a conversation happening a few booths away. A black woman, middle-aged, with the same kind of quiet dignity Clara Johnson had carried, was speaking to a young server. A girl who couldn't have been more than 18. The girl had asked a question about working in the city. About moving up in the world. And the woman had paused before answering. Rebecca recognized that pause. It was the pause of someone choosing their words carefully. Someone who had lived long enough to know that some lessons must be learned the hard way. Rebecca looked away. She had never noticed those pauses before. She had never thought to listen. Now, she understood why. Because the lessons buried inside those pauses were the ones she had spent her life ignoring. And the price of that ignorance had finally come due. The final reckoning. She left the diner, walking down streets that had not changed but felt different now. She found herself outside a library, a place she had not stepped foot in since she was a student. She walked inside, unsure of what had drawn her here, and wandered through the aisles until her fingers brushed against the spine of a book. The title was familiar. It was one of the books she had been assigned to read in school, one of the ones she had skimmed, dismissing it as dramatic, unnecessary, irrelevant to her own life. She pulled it from the shelf. The cover was worn, the pages slightly yellowed from time. She flipped through, scanning the words, and then she stopped. A passage, a single line. She read it once, twice, a third time, and then, standing in the middle of a public library, surrounded by the quiet hum of pages turning and people moving through a world that had left her behind, Rebecca Langley felt the truth of it settle inside her. A truth she could not ignore. A truth she wished she had known before it was too late. Somewhere else, life moves on. Clara Johnson stood in her garden. The sun warm on her face. The scent of fresh soil thick in the air. She knelt, pressing her hands into the dirt, feeling the weight of something real. Something that had existed long before that flight. Before Rebecca Langley. Before the world had learned her name. She had lived through worse. She had survived more. And she would continue, long after the rest had faded into dust. Her husband stepped onto the porch, watching her with quiet affection. "Everything okay?" he asked. Clara looked up, the lines around her eyes deep with wisdom, with experience, with the kind of knowledge that came only to those who had waited long enough to see the world correct itself. She nodded. "Yes," she said simply. She brushed dirt from her hands, stood, and walked toward the house. Because there was nothing left to prove. Because justice had already been served. Because life, as it always had, would move forward, with or without Rebecca Langley.